You guys may or may not remember there was a controversy just a few years ago in the mainstream newspapers discussing the possibility of whether or not Abraham Lincoln might have been gay, whether or not Abraham Lincoln might have been homosexual. And a lot of the kind of shallow discussion of this theory basically boiled down to people saying, oh, no. He was a president of the United States, therefore it's impossible. I remember looking into it. Although there was some basis for the rumor that Abraham Lincoln was gay, if you actually bother to do all the reading, my conclusion in the end was no. It's kind of a misinterpretation of slang from that period that no, I don't actually think Abraham Lincoln was homosexual. But be that as it may, we really need two different words in the English language. We need a word for cynicism, and then we need a word for phony cynicism. Because in response to these kinds of allegations, what a lot of people pretend is that they're so well informed and so cynical that they couldn't ever believe or take seriously, a crazy conspiracy theory like this. Why would it be a crazy theory that Abraham Lincoln was gay? Some people are gay. Like, it's not really that surprising. In this case, I don't believe the evidence. I think he was straight, but whatever. Some new evidence comes out. So what? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he was gay. I don't mind. But, there's a strange kind of phony cynicism that comes out, especially when we're talking about politics at the elite level. And these same people who seem flabbergasted, who seem quote-unquote cynical, when you suggest to them that Bill Clinton was someone who profited from the cocaine industry, that Bill Clinton had extramarital affairs and covered up these extramarital affairs, would they really be so shocked? Would they be so flabbergasted if we were talking about the leader of Russia, if we were talking about the leader of Indonesia, Egypt, if we were talking about political leaders in Mexico, and we say, oh yeah, there's this political leader in Mexico, but he got mixed up in the cocaine trafficking, and you wouldn't be quote unquote cynical about it at all. You'd be open to considering the evidence. Oh, okay, really? All right, let's look at the facts. Why would it be far-fetched or implausible or ridiculous for people to put forward the theory and put forward evidence that early in his career, Bill Clinton was connected to some really serious financial crimes, put it that way, and that these financial crimes ultimately trace back to the cocaine trafficking industry. This was in the period of time when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas. Okay. A new witness has come forward just in the last 2 years, as I understand the timeline. He's now over 60 years old. His name is Billy Jack Haynes. And he has been willing to go on the record and provide a new perspective, new testimony on Bill Clinton's involvement in cocaine trafficking in those years. And he's been willing to do so even though there's some possibility that he will go to prison now for accessory to murder. There's a pretty well-known slaying of two teenage boys who were killed in Arkansas during Bill Clinton's period in office. And there has always been debate about the extent to which Bill Clinton was involved with those killings. What is not debatable is Bill Clinton's involvement in obfuscating the investigation of the murder after the fact. So books have been written about this. There have been many court cases, inquiries, and lawsuits after these two boys were killed. And this is a little bit more like the RFK murder rather than the JFK murder. It's true of both. Very often the easiest part of the government conspiracy to prove is what happens after the assassination. Because the authorities are doing things that only the authorities can do. There's no possibility that it's the mafia or organized crime doing these things. What the coroner's office is doing, and the coroner's office working in conjunction with the governor's office and the chief of police, nobody else really can be responsible for these things. In this instance, talking about these two teenage boys who were killed, nobody really could be responsible other than Bill Clinton for what happened after the fact. So that was known, that was well documented, that was talked about for decades. The parents of the boys who were killed, they have always been keeping the pressure up. And now we have a man who comes forward and he says he was there. He was an unwilling participant in the murder of these two boys. And he describes the scene that many people have long suspected. I guess you could say no one could prove it definitively, but I don't know. I'd feel bad saying that. I think, honestly, that anyone who did really just an investigation of the accounting, investigation of the numbers of what was going on, financial transactions at that time that the Clintons were involved in, I think there was enough evidence of very serious criminal activity on Bill Clinton's part. But anyway, this eyewitness account pulls all the pieces together, and he confirms that yes, the reason why these two boys were killed was that they were witnesses to a cocaine trafficking shipment that took place. They were discovered under strange circumstances by the guys who were involved in this shipment. And he confirms that Bill Clinton's voice was on the phone, by cell phone, at that time, right up to and including the murder of these kids. He confirms that Bill Clinton very directly staged managed this shipment of cocaine. Okay. Now, some of you might revert to what I've just been describing as phony cynicism. You might say, well, this sounds ridiculous. Why? It sounds ridiculous for the same reason that it seems ridiculous, prima facie, to suggest that Abraham Lincoln was homosexual or gay. Like, well, he was a president of the United States, therefore he couldn't possibly be. Of course, what do you mean? Have some detachment here. You think presidents of the United States aren't human beings like anyone else? You think they don't have desires and a human heart and whatever? Some of them are going to be born gay. Some of them are going to be tragically heterosexual. It's neither here nor there. The idea that Bill Clinton, because of what he ended up accomplishing in politics, could not have possibly involved in this kind of criminal activity earlier in his career, it's worse than naive. It's not just stupid or jejune. It really is a kind of phony cynicism. I don't have a better word for it. The involvement of the CIA and the U.S. government in cocaine trafficking very much evolved as a sequel to their involvement in heroin trafficking. So to give you the history, the historical and political context for this pretty briefly, the British Empire really invented the international trafficking in heroin as a way to fund their global empire. Now, I'm sorry, I said heroin. Technically, it's opium. Opium and heroin are two different forms of the same drug. Today, in modern slang, we treat them as if they're the same thing. They are not actually exactly the same drug, but they come from the same plant, from the same type of flower, the same type of poppy. All right? The British Empire created a new form of evil in this world when they decided that their military occupation of India would be funded, would be paid for by the inhabitants of India, not by the taxpayers of the United Kingdom, of England, Scotland, and Wales. How could they possibly accomplish this? Well, they tried several different buffoonish methods to try to make imperialism pay. None of them worked. Like, we'll farm indigo. We'll force them to buy imported salt. We'll force them to buy imported cotton and cloth made in factories in Scotland. None of these schemes worked. The scheme that worked was opium trafficking. And the Queen of England became the world's most successful dope dealer overnight. Opium finally did for the British Empire what gold and silver never could. Other empires became very wealthy through gold and silver. The Spanish in Mexico, they started off looking for gold in the New World, but it really ended up being silver rather than gold. They made money out of both the Portuguese and the Spanish out in East Asia. Portuguese primarily, the silver trade. There's the spice trade, the Spice Islands, that's a different story. But for the British, it was beavers in Canada and it was opium in India that they made their fortune out of. The French Empire then tried to imitate this in Vietnam. The extent to which the French colonial project in Vietnam was an imitation of India is in part betokened or symbolized by the fact that they chose to name their colony in Vietnam Indochina. Indochina was a term meant to encompass a greater Vietnam. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, as much land as the French could control. The Vietnamese themselves always hated and resented the term Indochina and got rid of it as soon as they could. What does Indochina mean? It's the strategic location halfway in between India and China, and the French attempted to fund their colonial enterprise through opium trafficking, imitating the British directly. The French failed. When the French finally withdrew from Vietnam, when the French gave up and said, "We quit, we're going home," they took their dope dealing operation and they handed it over directly to American intelligence agents. That ended up being taken over by the CIA. Strictly chronologically speaking, at that time, it was not yet the CIA. They either handed it over to the OSS or the Pentagon, but a couple years later, the CIA was formed. The CIA took over dope dealing in Vietnam. So this was actually how the idea of American intelligence agencies engaging in international drug trafficking really, the seed was planted, and then the idea bloomed. Now, in terms of what political scientists say, like university-educated experts in politics, in terms of what they say about this, it's very strange that they tend to skip over the fact that there are tens of millions of dollars involved here. I think very, very few people actually read the congressional inquiries into the CIA history of drug dealing, because these are not rumors, these are not conspiracy theories. These are very well-established facts that the Senate and Congress have addressed many, many times. The involvement of American authorities in trafficking drugs into the United States and trafficking drugs around the world to fund their empire, just like the British Empire and the French Empire. Ultimately, that's what it's about. Academics will tend to jump over the fact that there are tens of millions of dollars involved, tens of millions of dollars per transaction in many cases, and they'll want to focus on some kind of more nebulous political motivation for this. I remember getting a lecture from one guy. This was at my university, at University of Toronto. He was giving this lecture about how somehow, like, the CIA's involvement in cocaine and heroin trafficking, like, it was motivated by a desire to make sure that the money was laundered through the American stock exchange so that the American economy would, There are a lot of people who try to portray it. I mean, for example, in the case of the Iran-Contra affair, they try to construe the drug dealing as if it's justified by or necessitated by, the secret operations, black ops or something. They try to find some motivation that's more heroic than these people did it because there were tens of millions of dollars involved. As if these people really sincerely believed that trafficking in cocaine and heroin was the only way to beat communism or was the only way to carry out American foreign policy objectives in Iran or Nicaragua or something. It's a joke. Look, guys, when you're talking about tens of millions of dollars, most human beings, they're going to be motivated by the tens of millions of dollars, and that's about it. The involvement of a bizarre miscellany of historical figures in the United States in the transshipment and distribution of CIA dope, CIA cocaine. Let's just stick with cocaine for this video. Whether or not that's directly part of Iran-Contra, from Colombia, or from other sources. More and more of those people now in 2019 are coming on YouTube and giving interviews. More and more of them, they've been to prison, they've gotten out of prison, and they've now written an autobiography, given interviews, given this kind of thing. The overall constellation of ambitious people who took advantage of the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make millions of dollars, not by colluding with career criminals, but by colluding with government authorities in committing a crime. The picture of that has been more and more filled in its details just in the last, say, 10 or 15 years. But in principle, all of these things have been known to people who care about politics since the 1970s. To quote ODB, this ain't something new that just came out of nowhere. So when we study history, we partly learn about new facts in old contexts. Let's put it that way. So yeah, listening to the story from Billy Jack Haynes, I learned some new things set in the past. Things that, obviously. But it also is a strange moment to reflect on who you are and how you've changed. You discover yourself in the study of history. I think more and more the older you get. I was intensely aware of how different my perception was of all these facts about Bill Clinton, how differently I perceive that now than I would have perceived it back in the year 1997 or the year 2001. My sense of what's normal in the conduct of authority and in the abuse of authority, and how people in power really do reach out to and work with and come to rely on thugs. And it can be fairly said that Billy Jack Haynes was a thug. He was a thug in the drug industry, in the cocaine smuggling and distribution industry. And he ended up, strangely enough, doing favors for someone in a position of tremendous power and influence, like Bill Clinton, back when he was the governor of Arkansas. My feeling now in looking back on this history, and in some ways, again, just having the story I already knew confirmed, the story I already knew in its outlines, having certain gaps filled in, and in looking back again at a story I hadn't thought about for many, many years. How often today does anyone really talk about Iran-Contra and its implications for the whole development of the mass drug addiction culture in the United States? It's such an important chapter of our history. United States, Canada, I'm Canadian, but it's a huge part of the history of the world. How the authorities themselves became subverted by drug trafficking, or you could say how the authorities subverted and co-opted the illegal drug trafficking industry. My feeling today in looking back on it is really a sense of betrayal by academia itself. I said on Twitter today that, one of the most corrupting influences in our lives is actually the attitude and the aesthetic of the professional historian. Professional historians are always presenting us with this version of history that's seemingly rational, where, the progress of one event after another seems to make sense. But this veneer of rationality is created through constant dishonesty. There's a kind of moderate and ongoing manipulation of the reader by the professional historian. And that's what we get used to. I mean, growing up as students, that's what we've come to expect. And then when you're confronted with a jarring narrative like this, Billy Jack Haynes telling you that he ended up being employed by Bill Clinton repeatedly to do dirty work, that there he is in a field by the train tracks at night with this cocaine shipment, and two people end up getting murdered, and he was there being paid to murder somebody else, which ended up not happening. The whole dark, sordid tale. In some ways, I feel we're conditioned by professional historians to reject that narrative because from that shallow standpoint, quote, it doesn't make sense. And as I've gotten older, it's not that I've become more cynical. I think I've really become more detached, and I think I've developed more compassion. Like in a really weird sense, where I can sympathize with the position Bill Clinton was in there. That Bill Clinton, at that stage of his career, he's not really a professional. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't know how to run a drug operation. He doesn't know, he doesn't know that in the future he's going to be elected president of the United States. None of that even occurs to him. That, he's this amateur working with other amateurs, and he's out of control, and, my expectations of human nature and of the progress of history in general, the aimless stumbling of history that we look back on and think of as progress, that for me has changed profoundly. If you're willing to look at history with some detachment, with some compassion, if you're willing to learn new things about the history that you probably lived through yourself, I'd encourage you to click on the links below this video. Hear the new perspective on the Clinton administration that I think people are still processing right now in 2019. From the witness to history, Billy Jack Haynes.